Let's continue now with the book of Galatians. And together with the book of Galatians, we're going to do the book of Romans. There's a reason for that. Galatians and Romans stand together. Galatians is a very early, as far as we can tell, a very early epistle. And yet, we're going to consider Galatians together with Romans, a later epistle, because the two are so deeply rooted or deeply connected in the issues that they consider, even in many cases, the logic that they follow. In fact, what I'm going to argue here in our lecture is that Galatians is like the short version of Romans. Romans, the more full-length, the complete; Galatians, the more concise and the more compact version of what we're seeing in Romans. But in order to get there, let me set up an introduction, or give us an introduction to both books and some of the concepts that are in these books. I'm going to give you the testimony of Martin Luther. And Luther's writing specifically about some of the core issues of Romans. Romans plays a basic part in Luther's conversion. And in that sense then, Romans plays a critical role in the entire Protestant Reformation and significant theological influences that come all the way to us today. So thinking about Luther's testimony, part of the reason that this is so poignant is that Luther is struggling with the basic issues, the core questions that Paul himself is dealing with in Romans. It is exactly proper and fitting that Luther found his answer in Romans, because Luther was finding his questions in Romans. The struggle is faced in Romans. And here's how he writes about it. In spite of the ardor of my heart, in other words, his personal determination to pursue righteousness, I was hindered by the unique word in the first chapter of Romans. The righteousness of God is revealed in it, the gospel. And I hated the word, or the expression, righteousness of God. I had been taught to understand it philosophically as the form or the act of righteousness, according to which God is righteous and he punishes sinners and the unjust. As a monk, I had led an irreproachable life. I still felt, though, like I was a sinner before God. My conscience was restless. And I'll just comment here, he's gone to the extreme that any person can do in themselves. I mean, he's taken the highest kind of standards, and he still doesn't feel righteous enough. I could not depend on God being propitiated by my satisfactions. Not only did I not love, I actually hated the righteous God who punishes sinners. And so a furious battle raged within my perplexed conscience. These words, righteous and righteousness of God, struck my conscience as flashes of lightning, frightening me each time I heard them. If God is righteous, he punishes. But by the grace of God, as I once meditated upon these words in the tower, the righteous shall live by faith and the righteousness of God, there suddenly came into my mind the thought that if we as righteous are to live by faith, and if the righteousness of faith is to be for salvation to everyone who believes, then it is not our merit, but the mercy of God. Thus my soul was refreshed. For it was the righteousness of God by which we are justified and saved through Christ. These words became more pleasant to me through this word the Holy Spirit enlightened me in the tower. And the richness of this is that Martin Luther is realizing exactly some of the concepts we're going to talk about in understanding Galatians and Romans. As we're going to emphasize and discover together, the core of both Galatians and Romans is this issue. It's the issue of the righteousness of God, the problem or the concern of righteousness. Let me show you this first in terms of seeing it laid out. If you walk through and you see how many times this occurs. So what I'm doing a search here for righteousness. And you're just going to see the number of references we have, both in Romans and Galatians. Things like this: the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. It is written, the just shall live by faith. Or not the hearers of the law are just justified, but the doers of the law shall be justified. Here, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings, the righteousness of God. And this just as a starter, I mean, this is only the first 3 chapters. I just want to point out one or two things here before I keep on going. Notice here, the just shall live by faith. I just want to point out for you that is the same word as the righteous shall live by faith. Same here. The hearers of the law are righteous before God. And the reality here is that just is the same meaning, even 400 years ago, the same English meaning as righteous. The righteous shall live by faith. But what's happening here is that because we're using different English words, righteousness versus just, then we're tempted to think these are different ideas. They're not. It's the same Greek word. And similarly, when we come to later in the verse, the doers of the law shall be justified. The reality, this is the verb form of the word righteous. So the doers of the law shall be declared righteous. The doers of the law shall be regarded and be declared as righteous. The reality of what's happening here in terms of why the translators chose to do this. Just is a synonym for righteous. The problem is we don't have in English a righteousify. Or we can say declare righteous, that's the closest we can come. But we don't have an equivalent word. So the translators are struggling, and it's impossible, an impossible situation in some ways, to be able to get that righteous idea into the verb form because we don't have an English word to make it work. And so therefore justify has become the standard word. But you just need to know for justify means declare righteous. And therefore, as you read that word in Romans and Galatians, this is what you're looking at. To be declared righteous. Now, I'll just keep on moving through the book. I just want you to see how often this is occurring. I'm only in chapter 5. Okay. And a very good way, a very good starting place for reading through the book of Romans is to go through highlighting, we've moved to Galatians now, I should say, highlighting justify or righteous or just. Okay, and read through both books looking for those themes. And you're going to end up with this core pattern that's significant, massively important for understanding the concerns of these two books. Let me show you what I've put here as a kind of a simple summary of a conceptual outline that I think is common to both books. A flow of thought that works like this. I think both books move from defining the gospel in the early chapters. Salvation is by faith, particularly, they're going to use the example of Abraham. Abraham's critical in the foundation for this. The gospel, this gospel of salvation by faith, brings freedom in place of the condemnation of the law. And we'll talk about that, slightly different shape for Galatians and Romans, but similar concept. The freedom of the gospel is the freedom to obey God. Here's the practical side of both books. Don't assume, oh, because it's the gospel, then I don't have to live differently. No, actually, both books call us to live righteously because of this. Okay, so that's the flow of thought or the trajectory, the basic progression for both books. And what I want to do now is go through, in turn, Galatians, then Romans, and show you some of that framework. Okay, let's start with Galatians. I want you to see how Galatians works through these concepts. And the first part of the book is an apologetic for the true gospel in place of the other gospel. Let me show you what I mean. Paul's going to start out Galatians saying, I marvel, I'm amazed, I'm surprised that you are so removed from the one who called you into the grace of Christ. You're removed to another gospel. But this other gospel is not another. And what he means by this is, gospel, of course, is the word good news. So you've been called, or you've been moved away to a different view of the good news, a different good news. It's not good news. People are going to pervert the good news about Jesus. And verse 8, even if we or an angel from heaven would preach any other good news, any other gospel, other than what we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. If anyone preach any other gospel, let him be accursed. He says it twice. I certify that the gospel which was preached from me is not by man or not sourced in people. It's not from people. And that's going to be followed immediately by an apologetic where Paul's going to argue that his gospel was not sourced in people. If you read down through the rest of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2, you're going to get the argument even historically. He's showing that he did not go to other apostles. He did not go to other human sources. His gospel is sourced in God, or specifically in Jesus. That's important for his argument. And it's important even for our understanding of the New Testament. One of my concerns, or one idea that we ought to understand of the New Testament, is that the entire gospel, the New Testament, is sourced in Jesus. Jesus, the teacher, the one who gives the truth in the Gospels. Jesus, who teaches his apostles then, is the source, and now the apostles go and they write or they record or they preach in the New Testament the words of Jesus. But the source of all of this is Jesus. That's part of Paul's argument here. Paul's argument here is, I did not receive this from man. I received this from God himself. I received this from Jesus himself. And that brings Paul then to the theological core of Galatians. You ought to know these references just so that you could recognize what is the centerpiece of his explanation of the gospel. I want to read it so that we have these concepts in our minds. A man is not justified by works of the law, but by the faith in Jesus Christ. Knowing that, we also have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified, declared righteous, by faith in Christ, not by works of the law. By the works of the law, no flesh will be justified. If while seeking to be declared righteous by Christ, in Christ, through Christ, if while seeking that we are also found sinners, is Christ therefore a minister of sin? God forbid. I think the argument or the logic here goes that if we allow this concept of justification by faith to then turn into freedom to go sin, then that turns off into a direction that actually would be impossible. It would mean Christ is causing us to sin. Absolutely not. If I build again the things which I destroyed, I'm a transgressor. I'm dead to the law, that I might live unto God. I'm crucified with Christ, yet I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. And that means then that I do not frustrate the grace of God. If righteousness came by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. You could see, just if you highlighted words through here, faith, law, faith, works, you can see that all the way through here, Paul is giving us a repeated contrast. Not that kind of righteousness. Yes, this kind of righteousness. And what's going to follow in the next section, as you keep on going now through Galatians, is you're going to get Paul arguing or demonstrating this, chapter 3, based on the example of Abraham. I would encourage you to read this. I'm not going to read through the section just because of the realities of time. But the argument here is that Abraham believed God, and Abraham was justified. And the argument that follows then is, if you look at Abraham's example, Abraham himself proves that salvation is by faith, not by one's own works. Okay, no, I'll pause here for a second. In a moment, we're going to jump over to Romans. We're going to see the exact same kind of logic happening in Romans with Abraham. And I'll just hold a question here for you. Why Abraham? Why is Abraham the ultimate example that Galatians and Romans are using in order to build up this argument? But before we go there, let's do the same thing. Okay, I just went through the early chapters of Galatians, and I wanted to demonstrate to you the basic flow of thought in Galatians. Let's jump over to Romans now. Let's do the same thing in Romans. And I'll start out here, Romans 1:16. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes. So here what of God is the gospel, the good news. Do you remember Galatians? Another gospel. Okay, we started out with a definition of what is the gospel. This is the definition of the gospel. It's the gospel about Jesus, not this other gospel. It's a gospel about Jesus. And that gospel is the power of God for salvation through faith. In other words, faith again is at the core, just like I had in Galatians. If it's not clear enough, keep on reading verse 17. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. And I think the idea of this, the expression from faith to faith, faith upon faith, faith in addition to faith. It's faith and faith, faith, just faith. Faith is the core of it. Why? The just shall live by faith. The righteous will live by their faith. He's quoting, pulling from the Old Testament, and it's the exact same quote that he used in Galatians. In other words, very closely connected arguments. What's going to follow in the next chapters, the rest of chapter 1 and chapter 2, will be an argument first that both Gentiles, chapter 1, and Jews, chapter 2, stand condemned. They stand condemned under God's law. In the case of Gentiles, because they have the law written in their hearts, but they reject it. In the case of Jews, because they were given the written law, and they still rejected it, or at least didn't keep it. And the argument then goes, both Gentile and Jew stand guilty before God. No one gets to come before God claiming their own righteousness. And that takes us now to what I'm going to call the theological heart of Romans. Remember, we did that with Galatians. Okay, the theological heart now of Romans chapter 3, verse 21. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be declared righteous in the sight of God. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. The law only brings to you an awareness of your sin. It only highlights your guilt. But now, in contrast and joyfully, the righteousness of God apart from the law is manifested. It's witnessed by the law and the prophets. The Old Testament points to this righteousness, but the righteousness is ultimately not through keeping the law. It's through the person that the law points to. The law points to him, a person. He is the source, or he is the means of that righteousness. The righteousness of God, which is by faith in Jesus Christ, to all and upon all that believe. Okay, look at the components of that. The righteousness of God, that we acknowledged or recognized that as a major theme of Romans. By faith, not by the law, but by faith specifically in Jesus and universally to anyone who believes. This "for there is no difference" points ahead to verse 23, which is a verse that we commonly use. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. We use this in the Romans road, right? Demonstrate that you have a need, that you need an answer, you need salvation. I just like to highlight here the context of it. It's to all and upon all that believe. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile, because all have sinned. You see the connection between the alls? So any person, any category of person can enjoy this salvation. Why? All of them sinned. They're all equally guilty. It's not based on whether you have the law or you don't, because all of us do have the law in some form. Even Gentiles have it written in their conscience. And so because all have sinned, because all have come short of the glory of God, all that believe can have the righteousness of God. And they can have the righteousness of God, verse 24, by being justified, by being declared righteous freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. So you see how all of these concepts interlock, and it all stands together. You have to have all of it together for this salvation to be possible. Verse 25, whom God hath set forth, Jesus Christ. God has set forth Jesus Christ to be a propitiation, to take care of the problem of wrath through faith in Jesus' blood, to declare God's righteousness for the remission of sins that are past through the forbearance of God. This is a thick verse. There's a lot of words here, and we've got to understand the concept of it, but we miss it because there's so many words in it. And so here's just the simple idea of it. How can a righteous God look at sinful people and say that they are righteous? In the same way that, how could a judge know that someone's guilty? Okay, I know you're guilty, I see that you're guilty, I confirm that you're guilty, but I'll let it go. See, that doesn't work. You can't do that. And you can't do that because that would not be righteous. Okay. How does a righteous God justify sinful humans? There's only one way, Paul argues. And the only way that God can be both righteous and declare sinners righteous. How can a righteous judge look at sinful people and say, I say you're righteous? Is by this means. God has set forth Jesus to be a propitiation. Those who believe in Jesus, in his blood, can be declared righteous for the remission of sins that they already did through the forbearance of God. Jesus alone is the way that this is possible. Where then is boasting? What is boasting? It is excluded. By what law of works? No, but by the law of faith. And that theological core appearing both in Galatians and Romans, the basic core, how can God forgive sinful humans? That core drives the entire argument. Last thing to highlight in Romans is this argument from the righteousness of, or the faith of Abraham. And that's now Romans chapter 4. So how then was Abraham's righteousness reckoned? How was it given to him? Was it when he was in circumcision or in uncircumcision? No, not in circumcision, but in uncircumcision. He received this, even yet being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed to them also. That all of us then would be children of Abraham, who also walk in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, which he had yet being uncircumcised. What's the line of logic here? Of kind of an unfamiliar flow of thought to us. But the idea here in Romans is that Abraham was already declared righteous. If you go back and you follow the logic and what's happening in Genesis, back in Romans 15, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. Back there, Romans 15. That's before circumcision happens. And even further, the richer, the complete logic of it is certainly then before the Mosaic law. I mean, circumcision becomes like the sign, the core of the Mosaic law. In a Jewish consciousness, this is the absolute indicator that someone is faithful to the Mosaic law. Well, Abraham is already believing God before Moses, long before Moses, before circumcision, because that comes later in the flow of Genesis. And already Abraham has been declared righteous. And Paul's argument then is, it can't be, it's impossible that righteousness would be by the law of Moses. Cannot be the way it happens. Because look at it, Abraham was already declared righteous before Moses, before circumcision. He's already declared righteous. How is that possible? Faith. Righteousness cannot come by the law, since this is the way, then, that we see the righteousness of Abraham. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second. I'm going to step back. What we've done so far, just in our progress thinking through this, we set up to recognize that Galatians and Romans are closely tied. We recognize that Romans is kind of like the long form of Galatians. If you take the argument of Galatians and expand it, then that, to some extent, is what you're looking at with Romans. And then we just did that. We walked through the first few chapters of Galatians and the first few chapters of Romans. We saw the pattern that is shared in both of them, this basic framework that both start out defining the gospel. What is it? What does it teach? And actually, both of them, interestingly, go to Abraham. Salvation is by faith because of the example of Abraham. And they're going to go back and cite this statement in Genesis. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. I asked earlier why Abraham, why they both go back to Abraham. I think the logic of that is that you can't get more Jewish than Abraham. And actually, though, it's not just that. If you go that back to Abraham, you realize he is pre-Moses. And so Paul's argument is, you've already got someone justified, declared righteous, before Moses. That tells you righteousness cannot be by the law. And therefore Paul's argument is, righteousness must be by faith. Look at this statement in Genesis. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. But I'm going to take a second to zoom out a bit. And I want us to see kind of the overall set of themes that I have in Galatians and Romans. I'm going to show you Galatians first. What you're going to see are a set of themes that are opposites. Okay, so in both cases, we're looking at a set of themes or a group of themes that stand on opposite sides. They're intentional contrasts. This is not like this. This and this are contrasting or very different. And let's see what that is in the case of Galatians. So the contrast I'm using here, Galatians is another gospel versus the true gospel. Okay, on the red side of it, Paul's going to show you what the alternative is, the false gospel. And we saw this set up in chapter 1. Another gospel, a fake gospel, a gospel that's not really good news. That other gospel is taught by, first level, false teachers, contrasted with the true gospel taught by Paul, but specifically not just Paul, apostolic authority. Taught, actually sourced ultimately in God himself, Jesus Christ himself. This is the true gospel. Jesus gave it. That's the logic. What does that false gospel teach? Moving back to this side. It teaches a salvation through the law or through circumcision. You kept the law, you kept the requirement of circumcision. That means you're okay. You're a righteous person. No, Paul says. The true gospel is going to connect to the Abrahamic covenant, to the promises made to Abraham, to the way of faith, next level. The false gospel would teach a kind of works salvation, that you keep the law and you get to what you need in order to be viewed as righteous. Whereas the true gospel will give you none other than faith, just faith. How would you accomplish a righteousness by law? How would you keep all the rules correctly in order to be viewed as righteous? Well, you would do that by the works of the flesh. In other words, by your own effort, by your strength. I did it. And Paul is saying, no, you can't do it by your own strength. The contrast goes, the Spirit, meaning God. God is the only one that can bring about this salvation. And the result then of trying to bring about righteousness by your own effort is only going to end in slavery. Bondage. I mean, you're just going to go deeper and deeper into trying harder and harder to be righteous enough. Remember Martin Luther, that sort of notion. But on the alternative side, if you will recognize the truth of the gospel, there's liberty, there's hope, there is true righteousness found in that. And it's the righteousness, or excuse me, it's the liberty, not just, okay, yes, now I can do whatever I want. Now I can go sin and not worry about it. That's not liberty, that's still bondage. But Paul's argument, it is the liberty of rejoicing in truly living out righteousness. It's the liberty to follow Jesus. It's the liberty to be righteous, literally. To actually live out the gospel and to be changed. And this is a framework that is exactly opposite to our contemporary thinking. Contemporary thinking of liberty goes, oh good, I get to do whatever I want. If I want to dabble around in sin, that's liberty. And the actual reality, biblical reality is, no, liberty means you get set free. Set free from the domination of sin in your life, sin that crushes you, sin that horrifies you. You need help because you are the terrorist that is destroying yourself. You need liberty in order to be righteous, liberty and freedom to follow God, liberty from sin and from condemnation. Okay, now let me move over, and I'm going to move now to Romans. I'm going to give you the same type of chart in the case of Romans, but let's look. There are a few differences. I've set up Romans, or organized our chart here, around, instead of another gospel and the true gospel, here, salvation by works, salvation by faith. Very similar. It's just I'm using different wording for it. I'm using wording that I think matches the book of Romans. And the contrasts run down some of the same flow of thought: condemnation versus righteousness, the works of the law versus faith, the flesh versus the spirit. We saw exactly that contrast in Galatians. Slavery and bondage versus liberty, Jewish promises versus Gentile salvation. Okay, so I end up with essentially the same chart, some slight differences of emphasis and such. Particularly here, the question of condemnation versus righteousness, that's not absent from Galatians, but it's a slightly different form here in Romans. One of the biggest differences between Galatians and Romans, however, is that Romans is going to take us much further down the path of contrasting Jewish versus Gentile promises. In the case of Romans, the question of how God can still fulfill his promises to the Jews. And I want to talk about that now. I'm moving to Romans chapters 9 through 11, the problem of Israel. Let me first show you what I'm just calling a summary of the chapters, basically to get an idea of the core concepts that are happening in these chapters. Romans 9 to 11. Have God's promises failed, since the Jews have not believed? Let me polish that a little bit so you can see the point of it. The notion of this goes, I have an entire Old Testament where God is promising, seemingly and clearly, to the nation. So over and over in the Old Testament, I'm going to see promises to Abraham, promises to David, and promises to the nation, that this nation will be great, this nation will be exalted. Blessing is connected to Jerusalem, to the temple, to the nation, to the land. There are all these pieces of this that seem so Jewish focused and Israel focused. And so therefore you're reading along and you're expecting that at the end of the Old Testament, the Messiah will come in a very Jewish way. He will bring victory and deliverance to the nation. And the nation of Israel will be exalted above all the nations. And in the end, all of the nations will come up and worship in Jerusalem with the Jewish nation at the pinnacle. Okay? That's not an invalid way of reading the Old Testament. It's also not a valid way because there's something a little deeper going on here. And where you get your first clue is that the irony of the Gospels presents us here that the Jewish Messiah did come. And he did come speaking and proclaiming deliverance and victory to the Jews, to the nation. John chapter 1, he came to his own things. His own people rejected him. He came to the nation. He came to use Pauline language, the Jew first. But in fact, the Jews were the leaders in rejecting the Messiah. And you're left now scratching your head. Wait, how are these Jewish promises fulfilled? I thought God made promises to the Jews, and now it seems that it turns out that these things seem to be Gentile. The promises seem to go towards Gentiles. And just to fill out this idea a bit more, watch the book of Acts. There's a progression in the book of Acts. As you move from early in the book, there's mostly Jewish response, both accepting and rejecting. There's even a very striking statement in Acts to say many of the priests also believed in the gospel through the preaching of the apostles. But at the very same time, it's clear that the Jewish establishment leads the way in rejecting this gospel. And as you keep on going, you're going to see increasing kind of crescendoing. As Paul will go to a new city, he will come in, he will preach, and some Jews and some Gentiles will accept, but then it will be the Jews that lead the way on persecuting, rejecting, and sending him out of the city. He goes to the next city, it happens again, and you get to the end of the book, and several times you have statements like Paul saying, I will go to the Gentiles, they will listen. And you have this notion that the faith or the reality, the gospel that you might have thought was going to be a Jewish thing is turning out to be mostly accepted by Gentiles. What went wrong? We thought this was a Jewish promise. So to go back to this framework, in the framework of these chapters, have God's promises failed? Since the Jews did not believe. Well, chapter 10, God clearly spoke his word to his people. They chose to reject. So part of the argument of chapter 10 is the rejection is not because God failed. In fact, God's purposes, even in Jewish rejection, lead to the blessing of the world, chapter 11. And eventually, and this is later in the argument, the salvation of the Gentiles was always part of God's plan. This was not an exception, this was not a surprise, but this was part of God's purpose and God's plan. I want to give one other concept just to answer the question that's not necessarily at the core of how Romans explain some of these ideas. But this idea is a Pauline idea and a New Testament idea. And part of the understanding we can have about the Old Testament Jewish promises is that the promises and the blessing are linked specifically to the Messiah. Why is Israel favored in the Old Testament? The Messiah will come from the nation. In fact, look, as you read the Old Testament, you actually could, at times, if you watch the history, you could wonder if Israel is favored. They sin. They're persecuted. They sin, and as a result of that, they're judged. The Babylonian captivity is horrifying. Is Israel blessed? Yes, but they're so wicked and they so fail so constantly that they're tossed about. They're actually buffeted. They're buffeted. They're actually suffering because of their sin. And it's only in the Messiah that you see the richness of this blessing. All the same, though, there is a national component to this. And here are a few kinds of questions that we ought to ask in respect to some of that. Questions like this: why does all of this matter? Are God's promises to Israel canceled? See, that would... Think about it. If God made promises to Israel and later did not fulfill them, would that not mean that we can't trust his promises? How can the law just be set aside? Can God just cancel his previous words? Are Gentiles better than Jews? Are Jews more important to God than Gentiles? See, those are really core questions. And those are some of the concerns, some of the difficult issues that Paul's raising in Romans and to some extent in Galatians. And part of the reason that these questions matter so much. Well, let me give one other answer to this. And again, now I'm going to go back to Romans. Part of the answer to these difficult questions: are God's promises canceled? Paul's answer in Romans is going to be very clear. Absolutely not. Did God's word fail? Absolutely not. Does God no longer care about the Jewish nation? Absolutely not. And you're going to see affirmations in Romans 9-11 that God absolutely is still committed to his word. The nation will be blessed. Israel will be saved. There will be a great outpouring of salvation, a great revival, and from Jewish people that will come in mass accepting the Messiah, trusting and understanding the salvation that is found in him. So this will come. But one other thing I want to highlight is Paul's beautiful argument that in fact, we're not talking about an Old Testament versus New Testament thing. It's not as though Old Testament in favor of Israel, New Testament in favor of Gentiles. Or the Old Testament promised things for Israel, but never mind, cancel that. New Testament. That's not what's happening. In fact, Paul's argument goes, I can prove some of this from the Old Testament. Let me show you. Romans chapter 15. Watch this. That the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy, as it is written. And what follows is an Old Testament quote. Again he saith, here comes another Old Testament quote. And again, praise the Lord, another Old Testament quote. And again, Isaiah says, Old Testament quote. And in each one of these, he's highlighting, just look through Gentiles, Gentiles, Gentiles. There's a basic pattern here, not just in the New Testament, but Old Testament as well, that God has always been concerned about the salvation of the world. And the framework for this goes, do I see blessing for Israel? I do. I see lots of promises in the Old Testament arguing that Israel will be blessed. Absolutely, it's there. Why? God will bless Israel. God will bless the world. In you, God says to Abraham, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. All of planet Earth will receive and enjoy the rich blessings that God intends for his people. All of that comes through the Messiah. Now, what we've done here, just to get our concept or to see our overall framework again before we continue, Romans and Galatians are deeply parallel. We saw the parallel argument in the early chapters of Galatians defining the gospel is by faith. The result of that then is righteousness. And we saw the same thing in Romans, same progress of thought. But do you remember when I gave those 4 themes, it was not just defining the gospel and not just emphasizing salvation by faith, but there was also this, the result of righteousness. The gospel brings freedom, and it's the freedom to obey God. It's the freedom to follow him and to live out righteousness, truly to see it happen in our lives. So I want us to understand and see that concept now in Galatians and in Romans, that both books are going to strongly argue how the gospel impacts our life and teaches us to live righteously as a result. Galatians first. Galatians 5:1, stand fast therefore in the liberty that Christ has made us free. Be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Okay, notice the parallel and the contrast. Liberty, Christ has made us free. Contrast, entangled, yoke, bondage. And if you remember my chart, the 2 sides, the other gospel, the true gospel, okay? So this kind of contrast between the 2 ways. If it was in that framework, then you're recognizing Paul's argument goes, the other gospel, salvation by works, by effort, by obedience to the law, that side versus Christ, faith, righteousness. Okay, within that framework, the argument goes that if you follow the way of the law, bondage, entangled. But if you follow the way of Christ, freedom, liberty. Again, one of the concepts I said earlier, when we say liberty in Galatians and Romans, if my heart says, oh good, I get to do all the sin I want, Paul's argument goes, what kind of liberty is that? That's not liberty. And here's the liberty that he's going to go further to describe. Chapter 5, verse 13. Brethren, you have been called unto liberty. Do not use that liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but use that liberty as an occasion by love to serve one another. The kind of liberty we're talking about is liberty, freedom for righteousness. And now he's going to describe what that looks like. The whole law. Again, remember, okay, we're contrasting the law versus the gospel. But here now, he's going to turn the law back, and we're going to recognize the positive reality of the law. The entire law is fulfilled in one word: love your neighbor as yourself. That's drawn from the Old Testament. It's recognizing, though, that ironically, if this is the contrast, here's fulfilling the law as a way of salvation, here's Jesus Christ and faith in him and bringing true righteousness. Believe it or not, this side, faith in Jesus Christ and his righteousness, actually ends up fulfilling this side as well. Ultimately, you fulfill the law through love. And his argument is going to link again to the Spirit. I say, walk in the Spirit, you will not fulfill the lust of the flesh, the bondage of the flesh. These two are in opposite principles, the Spirit, in terms of the true gospel, versus the flesh, your own strength, your own effort. The two are contrary. They cannot be together. They cannot work together. And now here, I'm just going to let's just recognize Paul's specific descriptions of these two. I'll go backwards. Here's the fruit of the Spirit. We're familiar with this passage: love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith. Against such there is no law. We love to talk about the fruit of the Spirit. One thing I would like to point out, we often forget or don't notice that it's preceded by the works of the flesh. And the logic here goes that if we're talking about the other gospel, the true gospel, that great contrast that we saw earlier, the other gospel, true gospel, law and Spirit. Okay, if we're talking about Jesus Christ, faith in Jesus Christ versus trying to accomplish your own righteousness by your own efforts, that contrast. Paul's argument goes, and this continues right into your practical life. So there are works of the flesh. If you're trying by your own effort to accomplish righteousness, here's what you'll get: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, a long list of vices. It's a vice list. All of these things are what happen if you try to accomplish your own righteousness by your own works. Here's the opposite: the fruit of the Spirit. And the fruit of the Spirit, what does that look like? Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. That's what results from the freedom that we have to follow Jesus Christ by love serving one another. And against those such things there is no law. The law affirms all of these things. Brothers, if we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. I'll put this in order to kind of, I hope, get those ideas back into our minds, put this back into the context again of this chart. The other gospel, what that results in is slavery, bondage, the flesh, and the works of the flesh. The true gospel, what that results in is liberty, true liberty, the liberty of the love, and that means the fruit of the Spirit. And so Paul moves straight from the gospel, the foundations, right across to move over into the practical. It will show in your life. It has to show in your life because the true gospel leads to this kind of liberty. Let's do the same thing if I jump over to Romans. And in the framework of Romans, I'm going to see this earlier in the argument. It happens in Romans 6 and 8, and here's how I summarize those two chapters. Romans 6, should we continue to sin that grace may abound? Paul's answer is no, absolutely not. You've been set free from sin. So the concept of faith and grace, oh good, I've been forgiven, now I can go back to it. No, you don't go back to it. Faith and grace will transform you. We're talking about person transformation. All of you will be changed. And that means then that Romans 8, it will look like this. You will live in the victory of the Spirit. The Spirit is going to accomplish things in you to transform you from the inside out. And so Paul will call you to live in that victory, to flourish in the victory that the Spirit brings. And you can work through the rest of Romans 8, the description of what that victory looks like in our practical living. Romans will build this idea out further in chapters 12, 13, 14. You're going to see in those chapters an explanation of what it means to live righteously. Classically, and this is just one passage, this is the transition passage between the theological side, 1 to 11, and the more practical side, chapters 12 and following. There's going to be this critical hinge point. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Be not conformed to this world, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. The rest of Romans is going to build that out. Because this is true, because you are learning this, being transformed by changing your thinking, go and live it out. Do what pleases God and live that way. And that will follow out the rest of the argument of Romans. I'll just end then with one more insight that I think is striking from the book of Romans, and that is the last chapter. We referred to this a bit when we talked about the introduction to the epistles. But I just want to highlight it one more time. When we get to Romans 16, we might be a little bit bored, if we admit it to ourselves, by all of the names. You just have all of these people: Rufus, Asyncritus, Hermes, Hermas, Phlegon, Patrobas, Philologus, Julia, Nereus, Olympus. You have all these names. What's the point of it? And I would just like to help us understand or recognize when you read this. This is like Paul inviting us as now 21st century readers to kind of look back, and it's as though he invited us into the church and he just introduces us around. He wants us to see over here, this brother, this sister. Okay, let's meet these three over here. Okay, let's talk to these over here. Let's see these. And what we're going to see, or what you find in that group, is that you have both Jews, Gentiles, a wide variety of different social statuses within the group. You have all kinds of different backgrounds that are represented in these names. And some of these names actually are probably slave names. And in some cases, then, you're looking at people that, based on just the little bit we can know, are probably more societally or socially on a higher status, and people that are on a lower status, Jewish, Gentile. And you're just looking around at all of these faces and you're realizing within God's church, there is an immense variety of people, but you're supposed to realize the fellowship that we have among God's people. And that just ends us out in the book of Romans. It helps us to finish out Galatians and Romans and realize the result of this gospel, the faith of Jesus Christ, what it means. It means that our entire lives are transformed. It means that our condemnation is set aside. We stand before God righteous, and we live it out all the way down to our relationships and those that we have fellowship with. I hope by studying Romans and Galatians, you can come away and rejoice in a deeper way about the righteousness that you have by faith in Jesus Christ. These books aren't necessarily easy to work with, and a couple of just pointers to get you into them. I would encourage you, start with Galatians. Work through Galatians first, because Galatians is the more compact version, and then moving from Galatians, move to Romans, the more expanded version of the two books. I would encourage you also, as you read, highlight, mark, underline the words just, righteous, justify, just to recognize that's the same word family. And then come to appreciate some of these core theological statements, Galatians 2, the last part of Galatians 2, the end of Romans 3, that are going to summarize the core of the issue for you. One other pointer for Romans specifically is that though as a Gentile living in the 21st century, the issue of Jewish promises, Gentile fulfillment, it doesn't bother me personally. Realize that that is a core issue that Paul is addressing. And it is something that's central to the question of how God fulfills his promises. Is he faithful to his word? It is a concern. And to recognize that God does fulfill his word, he still will bring blessing to the Jewish people, but he's bringing blessing to the Gentile people. The fullness of blessing is just even greater than what he promised, not less, even more. And in all of that, the absolute core and center of both Galatians and Romans, realize the preciousness of what it means that you did not accomplish your own righteousness by your efforts and your work at following the law. But this was only possible through the wisdom and the grace of an almighty God who provided a propitiation for your sins so that Jesus is my righteousness, so that I am viewed before God and in his presence in terms of Jesus Christ. And in him then, now I have the freedom to live righteously. Not a freedom to go back to sin, not a freedom from the law so I can do whatever I want, a freedom to love, to pursue, to follow truly the example of Jesus Christ, my master and my king, so that the result of this liberty and of this gospel is actual righteousness, having been declared righteous to then live righteously. And on that basis, knowing the gospel, living the gospel, let us then live righteously, honoring our master and our king.